The steel door slammed shut with a heavy echo that rolled down the silent corridor. Inside the narrow concrete cell, a man sat alone on a cold bed that was built into the wall. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stared at the small slit of light above him, a window so thin it barely showed the sky. A voice crackled through a speaker. "Stand for count." The man stood slowly, like someone who had forgotten what time even meant. This was not just any prison. This was ADX Florence in Colorado, United States. A place where silence is not peace, but punishment. And in this place, something had already gone very wrong. Because years earlier, inside this same prison that was built to be escape-proof and violence-proof, one inmate had been killed. How did that happen in the most secure prison in America? And what did the guards discover that changed this prison forever? To understand that, we have to go back. Back to a time when even prisons were losing control. In the early 1990s, the United States prison system was facing a serious problem. Violence inside prisons was rising fast. Some inmates were not just criminals, they were leaders of powerful groups. Even behind bars, they gave orders. They planned crimes. They controlled others. Guards were being attacked. Prisons were no longer just places to lock people away. They were becoming dangerous command centers. The government knew something had to change. Not just stronger walls. Not just more guards. They needed something different. Something extreme. So they designed a new kind of prison. A prison that would not just hold inmates, but isolate them completely. That prison became ADX Florence. It opened in 1995, built deep in the harsh land of Colorado. From the outside, it looked simple. Low buildings. Concrete. Quiet. But inside, everything was designed for control. Every hallway was curved, so no one could see what was ahead. Every door was controlled from a central room. Guards did not carry keys. Cameras watched everything. Sensors tracked movement. Even the floors could detect footsteps. This was not just a prison. It was a machine. A machine built to control human beings completely. And only the most dangerous people were sent here. People like Ted Kaczynski, who carried out a long bombing campaign. Or Ramzi Youssef. Or Richard Reed. And later, even Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were considered too dangerous for any normal prison. At ADX, the goal was simple. Total control. When an inmate arrived, everything changed. They lost their clothes. They lost their personal items. Even their sense of time began to fade. They were placed in a small cell. 7 feet wide. 12 feet long. A concrete bed. A metal toilet. A small desk. And a narrow window that showed only a piece of sky. No view. No connection to the outside world. Days became hard to track. There were no clocks. No calendars. Just light and darkness. Over and over again. Each day followed the same pattern. Food came through a small slot in the door. No talking. No contact. 1 hour outside the cell, but still alone. Even the yard was just another concrete box. You could feel the air. But you were still trapped. For many inmates, the hardest part was not the walls. It was the silence. No voices. No conversations. Just thoughts. And sometimes, those thoughts became the real enemy. Some inmates tried to stay strong. They created routines. Wake up. Stretch. Read. Think. Sleep. Repeat. Because without structure, the mind could break. And for some, it did. Reports began to show that long-term isolation could cause serious mental problems. Depression. Hallucinations. Confusion. Some inmates even harmed themselves. Others shouted through the walls, trying to hear another human voice. But most of the time, there was only silence. Still, in the early years, there was one small difference. Inmates were sometimes allowed limited group activities. Very controlled. Very rare. But still, a moment where human beings could see each other. That small contact mattered. Even if it was just a few minutes. Even if it was heavily guarded. It reminded them they were not completely alone. But that would not last. Because one day, something happened that changed everything. During one of these group recreation sessions, a man named Manuel Tati Torres, known to be connected to a prison gang, was attacked by other inmates. It happened quickly. Planned. Silent. By the time guards reacted, it was too late. This was shocking. Because ADX Florence was supposed to be the safest prison in the country. No inmate had ever been killed there before. And now, it had happened inside the most controlled environment possible. The prison system reacted immediately. There would be no more chances. No more group sessions. No more contact at all. From that moment on, ADX became a place of total isolation. Every inmate alone. Every hour. Every day. No exceptions. And that decision changed everything. Because now, survival inside ADX was no longer about dealing with other inmates. It was about surviving yourself. As the years passed, stories began to come out. Stories of what life inside really felt like. Some inmates said the silence was the hardest part. Others said it was the endless routine. Some said they felt like they were disappearing. Slowly. Piece by piece. And outside the prison, people began to ask questions. Was this necessary? Or was it too much? Was ADX protecting society? Or destroying the minds of the people inside? The debate was growing. But inside those walls, nothing changed. The doors still opened and closed from a control room. The cameras still watched every movement. The silence still filled every corridor. And the inmates were still alone. But something else was happening. Something deeper. Because while the prison was designed to control behavior, it could not fully control the human mind. And for some inmates, that mind began to break in ways no one expected. And soon, the world would hear stories that would make people question everything about ADX Florence. Stories that would lead to lawsuits, investigations, and shocking discoveries about what was really happening inside America's most secure prison. And that is where the real story begins. The noise started as a faint echo. A distant banging. Then another. Then another. Inside the silent walls of ADX Florence, where quiet was supposed to control everything, the noise spread like a signal. Metal against metal. Fists against doors. Voices shouting into emptiness. For some inmates, silence was no longer something they could survive. It was something they were fighting against. And for the guards, this was becoming a different kind of danger. Not violence between inmates, but something harder to see. The slow breaking of the human mind. But to understand how things reached this point, we need to step deeper inside ADX Florence. Not just the walls, but the lives of the men trapped inside them. Every inmate in ADX lived by the same rule. Isolation. 23 hours a day inside a cell. 1 hour outside, alone. No conversations. No physical contact. Even movement was controlled. When an inmate left their cell, they were placed in restraints. Hands secured. Feet controlled. Escorted by guards who followed strict procedures. No sudden movements. No risks. Everything was calculated. Everything was controlled. At first, many inmates tried to stay strong. They built routines. Wake up. Exercise in the small space. Read whatever books they were allowed. Write letters, even if no one replied. Some prayed. Some counted days. Some tried to remember the world outside. But slowly, something changed. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Months into years. And the mind started to drift. One former inmate later described it simply. You begin to lose track of who you are. Without people, without conversation, without change, the brain starts to react. Some inmates began to talk to themselves. At first, quietly. Then louder. As if trying to replace the missing voices. Others began to imagine things. Sounds that were not there. Footsteps in empty corridors. Voices behind the walls. Some would shout just to hear something back. Even if it was only an echo. One inmate, later identified as Jack Powers, became one of the most talked about cases. After years in isolation, his mental state became unstable. He began harming himself. Not because of violence from others, but because of what was happening inside his own mind. His case shocked many people outside the prison, because it raised a serious question. What happens when a person is left alone for too long? Another inmate, Travis Dusenbury, found a different way to survive. He focused on the smallest thing: snow. Through the narrow window in his cell, he could sometimes see snow falling. That tiny change in the outside world was enough to remind him that time was still moving, that life still existed somewhere beyond the walls. For him, that was enough to hold on. But not everyone could do that. Inside ADX, the pressure was constant. Not loud, not obvious, but always there. And sometimes, it came out in strange ways. Inmates would bang on doors for hours. Some would shout through the vents. Others would throw objects just to create sound. Not out of anger, but out of desperation. They needed something, anything, to break the silence. For guards, this created a new challenge. They were not just watching dangerous criminals anymore. They were watching men slowly losing control of their own thoughts. And when control is lost, anything can happen. The system inside ADX was designed to reward obedience. If an inmate followed the rules, they could earn small privileges. A book, a radio, limited television. Simple things. But in a place like ADX, those small things meant everything. Because they gave structure. They gave distraction. They gave something to hold on to. But if an inmate broke the rules, the punishment was immediate. Privileges removed. More restrictions. Sometimes even less contact with the outside world. And in extreme cases, force was used. There were reports of use of force incidents. This could mean anything from physical restraint to full cell extractions by trained teams. Guards in protective gear, carefully entering a cell, controlling the inmate, removing any threat. These moments were controlled, planned, but they showed something important. Even in a place built for total control, there were still moments where things could go wrong. Some inmates claimed guards were too strict, that small actions could lead to serious punishment. Turning your head, not responding fast enough. Small things. But in a place like ADX, every action mattered. And every reaction had consequences. One of the most controversial practices involved restraint chairs. Inmates who refused orders or became aggressive could be secured tightly into a chair, unable to move. Watched constantly. It was meant to control behavior. But critics outside the prison began to question it. Was this necessary? Or was it going too far? Another case that raised concern involved an inmate who went on a hunger strike, refusing food for weeks. In response, medical procedures were used to keep him alive. This included feeding through a tube, a process that many described as painful and difficult. For prison officials, it was about keeping inmates alive. For critics, it raised ethical questions. Again, the same question appeared. Where is the line between control and harm? Outside the prison, attention was growing. Lawyers, journalists, human rights groups. They all began to look more closely at ADX Florence. And what they found raised serious concerns. Reports suggested that many inmates inside ADX had mental health conditions. Some estimates said nearly 1/3 of the population. That meant many inmates were not just dangerous. They were also vulnerable. And in an environment like ADX, that vulnerability could become much worse. In 2012, a group of inmates took legal action. They filed a lawsuit against the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Their claim was clear: that the conditions inside ADX were too extreme, especially for inmates with mental illness. They argued that long-term isolation caused serious harm, that it was not just punishment, but something more severe. The case gained attention because it was not just about one inmate. It was about the entire system, and whether it had gone too far. During hearings, officials from the prison system defended ADX. They argued that the prison was necessary, that it held the most dangerous individuals, people who could not be managed anywhere else, and that strict control was the only way to keep everyone safe. But critics pushed back. They pointed to international standards. In some countries, solitary confinement is limited to just 15 days. ADX. Some inmates had spent years, even decades, alone. The contrast was clear. And the debate became louder. Inside the prison, nothing changed immediately. The doors still locked. The cameras still watched. The silence still filled the air. But outside, pressure was building. And eventually, something had to change. In 2016, a settlement was reached. The prison system agreed to improve conditions, especially for inmates with mental health issues. More screenings were introduced, more professional care, and some inmates were transferred to other facilities, places where they could receive better treatment. It was a significant moment, because it showed that even a place like ADX Florence could not ignore what was happening inside forever. New programs were also introduced. One of them was called Stages. Steps toward awareness, growth, and emotional strength. The goal was simple. Help inmates manage their behavior, understand their thoughts, and slowly adjust to less restrictive environments. For some inmates, this offered hope. A path out of total isolation. But not everyone qualified. And not everyone improved. Because even with changes, the core of ADX remained the same. Control, isolation, silence. And for many inmates, the damage had already been done. Years of isolation cannot be undone quickly. The mind does not recover overnight. And for some, it never fully recovers at all. This created another problem. What happens when inmates leave ADX? Because eventually, some of them do. They return to the outside world. A world full of noise, people, movement, choice. After years in silence, that world can feel overwhelming. Some former inmates struggled to adjust. Crowds felt too loud. Conversations felt too fast. Simple decisions became difficult. One former inmate described it as stepping into another planet. Everything felt different. Everything felt too much. And in some cases, that difficulty led to serious consequences. Not because they wanted to return to crime, but because they no longer knew how to exist outside. This raised another important question. Does ADX Florence protect society? Or create new risks? Because if inmates leave in a worse condition than they arrived, what does that mean for the future? The debate continues. Some people believe ADX is necessary. That certain individuals are too dangerous for any other system. Others believe it goes too far. That no human being should be isolated for so long. Both sides have strong arguments. But inside ADX, the reality remains the same. The doors close. The lights stay on. The silence continues. And the inmates continue to face the hardest challenge of all. Not escaping the prison, but surviving their own minds. And as more stories began to emerge, as more voices spoke out, the world started to ask one final question. If a place is designed to break people, what happens when it succeeds? And more importantly, what kind of people come out the other side? That is where the story takes its darkest turn. And in the next chapter, we will see what happens when inmates finally leave ADX Florence, and why some of them cannot escape it, even after they are free.